Some lies are so carefully crafted, they return as truth. This story begins with an unclaimed suitcase on platform 7. Inside it, a single glove, a vial of laudanum, and a name that never truly belonged to anyone. As Holmes peers into a theatre of illusions, we uncover a disappearance built not on silence, but on performance. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The curtain has lifted, the stage is set. Let us now follow Holmes into the shadows of the truth. It was upon a grey March afternoon, one of those damp, lifeless days peculiar to the southern counties, that Holmes and I found ourselves returning from a routine errand in the Surrey countryside. We had concluded the matter of a disputed codicil between two ageing sisters with minimal excitement, and were passing through Clapham Junction with the sort of mutual silence that often accompanied our less eventful days. Holmes, cloaked in his long Inverness and tapping his cane lightly on the platform, appeared content to remain in his own thoughts. I was preparing to consult the railway timetable for our next departure when I noticed my companion had come to an abrupt halt near a row of benches on platform 7. His head tilted ever so slightly, his eyes narrowed with that peculiar intensity I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. Without a word, he motioned me to his side. There, wedged inconspicuously beneath the iron arm of a bench, stood a battered brown suitcase. Its leather corners were scuffed, and the handle hung loosely, as if the weight of its contents had proven too much for its aging frame. Around it, the world moved indifferently. Porters shouted, travellers bustled, and yet the case remained, untouched, unregarded, and profoundly alone. Holmes crouched slowly beside it, his gloved hand hovering but never making contact. A suitcase, I remarked with a shrug. Perhaps someone left it in haste. Or, Holmes murmured, perhaps it was left with purpose. At Holmes's request, a station porter was summoned, an older fellow with a ruddy face and the unmistakable weariness of long hours. That one, the porter said, squinting at the suitcase. Been there since this morning, sir. First noticed it just after the 8:15 from Woking came through. No one's claimed it. No tag, no initials, no inquiry. We thought it might belong to a traveller who would soon return. Holmes nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the object. And yet, no such traveller has returned, he murmured. The porter shook his head. Not a soul. We don't like to touch things without good reason, sir. Not in these times. Wise, Holmes replied, rising to his feet. In unattended objects, the world often places its secrets. Though the station bustled with energy, it seemed to me that a peculiar hush had gathered around that weathered case, as though the very air around it had recoiled from something left unsaid. Holmes's gaze was fixed, not upon the suitcase's surface, but upon its silence. What is it, Holmes? I asked. Merely a question, he replied, for which the answer may not yet wish to be known. Holmes knelt once more beside the suitcase, producing his small brass lens and applying it in that meticulous manner I'd seen him reserve for corpses, forged wills, and cigar ash. Observe, Watson, he said quietly, indicating the area around the buckle. The clasp is misaligned, only slightly, but enough to suggest a hand unfamiliar with its operation. And here, the leather is worn more heavily on one side than the other. Someone has tried to open it in haste. I bent closer, and indeed perceived a shallow abrasion along the brass lock, as though a key had been applied, withdrawn, then reapplied with trembling hands. Not an ordinary lost item, Holmes mused. This is a message. The difficulty lies in determining for whom it was intended. He moved to the base, noting with a frown a faint watermark, a half-ring, perhaps from a bottle placed hurriedly upon it. Rainwater from this morning's drizzle, mixed with coal soot. It was not left indoors, but rather dragged here from some open space. Do you suggest it was abandoned en route? I asked. No, Watson, Holmes said, his voice low. I suggest it was placed here deliberately by someone who did not intend to return for it. A chill stirred within me that the late winter breeze could not account for. At Holmes's prompting, the station master was summoned and, after a brief conference, the local constable arrived. The suitcase, having waited in silence, was now surrounded by official eyes and cautious hands. Holmes stepped back, allowing the authorities to proceed. The constable fumbled with the buckle, and after a reluctant twist, the lock gave way with a metallic sigh. The lid creaked open. Its contents were spare, but deeply unsettling. Resting atop a layer of folded muslin was a woman's glove. Soft suede, pale cream, the fingers long and unblemished save for a single faint brown stain at the tip. Beside it lay a small glass vial, no larger than a thumb, half filled with a yellowish liquid. Holmes needed no confirmation to know it was laudanum. There was also a men's cufflink, gold, oval, and engraved with a decorative monogram. But the letters were too stylized to read at a glance. Lastly, curled in the corner, a slip of crisp paper, a receipt from the Blue Swan Hotel, Dartmore. It was unsigned, dated 3 days prior. "That's it?" the constable muttered, perplexed. "A woman's glove and a bottle of sleeping draught?" Holmes's eyes did not leave the contents. "The glove speaks of a woman," he murmured. "The cufflink, of a man. The laudanum, of intention. But it is the receipt that speaks of place." And place, I knew, was often the key to everything. Though intrigued, the constable soon deemed the contents insufficient for police involvement. With no sign of violence, theft, or identification, he dismissed the matter as the forgotten luggage of a nervous traveller. Holmes, however, remained still. He did not speak as the suitcase was taken to the station's lost property office. He simply stood by the bench on platform 7, his eyes lingering on the place the suitcase had rested. "I take it you disagree with the constable's judgment," I ventured. "I do not judge him," Holmes replied. "Only the limitations of his imagination." He turned slowly and walked towards the station exit. I followed in silence until he added, "Watson, the world rarely places such careful contradictions in a single case. A woman's glove paired with a man's cufflink. A sleeping draught alongside an unsigned receipt. These are not accidents. They are arrangements. And what of the person who arranged them?" Holmes glanced at me with a strange light in his eye. "That, my dear Watson, is what we shall soon discover." That evening, long after the last of the March light had faded from Baker Street, we were seated before the fire, where Mrs. Hudson admitted a well-dressed man, no older than 40, whose expression bore the unmistakable signs of anxious restraint. "My name is James Kent," he said, removing his gloves with deliberate care. "I have come on a delicate matter, Mr. Holmes. One I would prefer to remain confidential." Holmes inclined his head. "You may speak freely, Mr. Kent." The man retrieved an envelope from his coat and laid it upon the table. "This arrived at my club this morning. I do not recognize the handwriting." Holmes opened the envelope with a silver blade and withdrew the note. I read over his shoulder. "The truth always travels lighter than a suitcase. Pay £500 by Thursday, or the matter of your sister-in-law will be made public." Holmes's eyes flashed. "I assure you," Kent said quickly, "I have done no harm to Miss Eliza Kent. She is my wife's sister. She went missing over a month ago, left the house and never returned. We reported it, of course, but no leads have surfaced." Holmes folded the note and placed it gently on the table. "Tell me, Mr. Kent," he said, his voice cool, "have you ever visited Dartmore?" Kent looked startled. "Dartmore? No. Why do you ask?" But Holmes did not answer. His eyes were already elsewhere, on the fireplace, the shadows, and I suspect, on the battered suitcase still echoing in his mind. Our journey to Dartmoor the following morning was undertaken beneath a grey canopy of shifting cloud and wind-lashed drizzle. The sort of weather which always seemed to please Holmes in some arcane and morbid way. He sat opposite me in the compartment, his arms folded, the the toes of his boots pressed together and his eyes half closed in that curious state of mental incubation I had witnessed 100 times before, when he was thus silent, unmoving, yet intensely present. I knew better than to interrupt. The crumpled hotel receipt from the suitcase, which now lay between us on the seat, bore a single name: Blue Swan Hotel. The date of check-in was 3 days prior, and though unsigned, Holmes had memorized its form at a glance. You believe the woman who signed in under the name of Miss Eliza Kent is the very same whose glove lay in the suitcase? I ventured, breaking a silence that had grown heavy. I believe the woman who registered under that name wished to be seen, Holmes replied without opening his eyes, and also wished to be forgotten. That contradiction intrigues me. As the train creaked into motion once more, he added quietly, "Let us discover if Dartmoor's fog hides merely weather or the echo of something darker." Nestled amidst the heather-strewn rise of Lower Lustley stood the Blue Swan Hotel, an establishment of refined proportions but waning reputation, well suited for travellers who preferred discretion to comfort. Upon arrival, Holmes asked for the manager, who proved to be a cautious, clean-shaven man named Ellis, with an overly apologetic manner and a passion for polished brasswork. Holmes wasted no time. 3 days ago, a woman checked in here under the name Miss Eliza Kent. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Ellis replied. A single lady, pale complexion, carried only a handbag, stayed in room 6. She departed rather suddenly, no notice given. Departed, Holmes repeated, his eyebrow rising. Do you mean she left, or that she disappeared? Ellis shifted uncomfortably. She vanished, sir, quite literally. Stepped out after dinner on the second night and was not seen again. We sent a boy to the constable, but there was no sign of her in the village. Odd case, that. Holmes requested to view the register. With gloves donned, he turned to the appropriate page and studied the handwriting. A curious flourish on the K, he remarked, then compared it to a letter from the client, which he drew from his inner pocket. Yet it is not Eliza Kent's hand. She did not sign for meals either, Ellis added. She rarely spoke to anyone. Holmes closed the register gently and murmured, "Then the mystery deepens, not of who vanished, but of who never was." We were granted access to room 6, which, Ellis insisted, had remained untouched since the woman's disappearance. Though modest, the room possessed a certain faded charm. Holmes moved through it with slow, deliberate steps, his hands behind his back, his head tilted. She paced, he murmured. Note the uneven wear in the carpet by the window. Indeed, the plush was flattened in a narrow track that ran between the bed and the sash. Holmes stood at the window, peering out toward the distant road that wound between the hills. I joined him there. She stood here for long intervals, he said, expecting someone. From the maid we learned that the woman had spoken little and always took her meals in her room. She had ordered supper for 1 on the first night, but for 2 on the second. Odd, is it not, Holmes said, that no second guest ever appeared? The maid hesitated. She looked terribly anxious, sir, like she feared someone might come, rather than hoped it. Holmes examined the fireplace. With his cane, he stirred the ash, revealing a fragment of charred paper. Half a sentence, ink faded, but with the word arrival still discernible. Lastly, he stooped near the dressing table and extracted with a pin a single strand of long auburn hair caught between the wood and the hinge. He straightened slowly. This room has not seen a disappearance, Watson. It has witnessed a performance. And like all theatre, its greatest secrets lie behind what was meant to be seen. Holmes returned to the fireplace with renewed intent, kneeling before the grate and withdrawing a small envelope from his coat pocket. From it, he produced a pair of tweezers and a square of treated linen. I watched in silence as he sifted through the grey remains of old ash with the calm deliberation of a surgeon in dissection. Here, he murmured, isolating a piece of paper no larger than a postage stamp. Burned hastily, too hastily. The fragment bore a blurred line of ink, just legible under the lens Holmes applied. Will arrive Thursday. He placed it carefully in the linen and returned to the grate. This room, he said softly, has seen deception enacted and then obliterated in haste. He rose and turned to the dressing table, where a delicate mirror, its surface fogged with age, stood tilted upward. Holmes opened the drawer beneath and slowly ran his hand along the inside edge of its frame. There, nearly imperceptible, caught between hinge and wood, was a single strand of hair, auburn, long, and to my eye, freshly shed. Holmes removed it without a word and held it against the light. Miss Eliza Kent, according to her family, was dark-haired, almost black. Then this is not hers? I asked. It is not, Holmes said. A cold sensation crept into my spine, not from the wind that rattled the sash, but from the implications his tone carried. We must now ask, he said, who placed this hair, and why they wished it mistaken for another's. As he folded the hair into a slip of wax paper, I knew that this was no longer a question of a woman vanishing, but of someone constructing her from fragments, only to let her disappear on command. Back downstairs, Holmes requested a copy of the room service logs for the days in question. Ellis, the manager, hesitated, but after Holmes explained our purpose in terms of confirming dietary irregularities, the documents were soon laid before us. The entries were brief but legible. Miss Kent had ordered a solitary supper on her first evening, cold roast, bread, and a pot of tea, but it was the second night's entry that drew Holmes's attention. Supper for two, he said aloud, tapping the notation. Poached haddock, 2 plates, 2 cups, 1 decanter of claret. And yet no one saw a visitor, I added. Ellis shook his head. No, sir. No gentleman in or out. We'd have noticed. Unless he entered by other means, Holmes murmured. The hallway to the guest rooms had no back staircase, and Ellis confirmed there were no adjoining doors between chambers. Holmes appeared dissatisfied. It is the type of error, he said, that reveals more than it hides. An error? I asked. Had she truly dined with another, Holmes said, she would not have called for 2 dishes herself. No, this was a fabrication, a planted illusion. He paused, then added with a cold certainty, an invisible guest is always more dangerous than a visible one, for they are not seen, but made to be imagined. After returning to the front office, Holmes once again requested the guest register. With the permission of Ellis, he laid the open volume across the desk and removed a folded sheet of correspondence from his coat. This, he said, handing it to me, is a letter from the real Miss Eliza Kent, written, I'm told, just 3 weeks prior. I examined the script. It was firm, deliberate, and somewhat angular. Each letter stood apart with dignified precision. Holmes then placed it beside the entry signed Miss Eliza Kent in the register. At first glance, it was a fair match, but under closer scrutiny, differences emerged. The signature in the register bore a roundness to the loops, and a telltale upward slant to the final T, an affectation not present in the authentic hand. Holmes leaned back and steepled his fingers. It is a forgery, he said. But a careful one, I replied. Surely close enough to deceive the untrained eye. Precisely the aim, Holmes said. It is the counterfeit that wishes not to be noticed that is most insidious. He closed the register gently and turned to me. Watson, this woman did not come here to vanish. She came to appear. Whoever she was, her role was rehearsed, and her signature, like her name, is a costume. A silence fell between us. Holmes's eyes drifted to the darkening panes of the window. And where there is costume, Watson, he said, there is always a playwright in the wings. That night, we took rooms at a modest inn just beyond the village square. Holmes declined supper and spent several hours silently rereading the hotel receipt and registry excerpts. occasionally glancing at the burnt paper scrap with a faraway look. It was just past 11 when I was stirred from my reading by the soft rasp of paper sliding against wood. Holmes crossed the room with feline swiftness and retrieved the envelope that had been slipped beneath our door. It bore no name. Inside was a single folded page, scrawled in a hand quite unlike that of our client or the forged register. "You seek the name of the owner. Beware. Some suitcases are best left unopened." Holmes read the note twice, then held it to the lamp, scanning for watermarks or pressure marks. There were none. "Curious," he said softly. "You expected this." "I hoped for it," Holmes replied. "The moment an investigation begins to provoke reaction, it begins also to reveal its authors." He handed me the note. "What do you make of it, Watson?" I turned it over in my hand. "A warning or a threat?" Holmes nodded. "But to threaten is to confess alarm. Our quarry is closer than they wish us to know, and far more afraid than they appear." He returned to the window, looking out into the mist-silvered road below. "And now," he said with an edge in his voice, "the game is truly afoot." The next morning, Holmes suggested we walk the village and rattle the trees, as he put it, to see what might fall. It was a phrase I had learned to interpret loosely, but always found effective in practice. While he examined the back lanes near the Blue Swan, I made inquiry among the locals, whose speech and eyes hinted at a wary reserve born more of custom than caution. It was behind the stables of the inn that I encountered a boy of no more than 13, his hands blackened with saddle grease, and his gaze quick as a fox. He had watched us approach with the curiosity of a creature accustomed to being overlooked. When I asked whether he had seen anything unusual the night Miss Kent vanished, he hesitated, then nodded. "There was a man, sir," he said. "Didn't come through the front. I saw him near the back wall where the rubbish gets thrown." "What sort of man?" The boy's fingers moved to his cheek. "Had a scar, long, down this side, like he'd been cut open once." He looked down and added in a near whisper, "He saw me. Didn't say nothing, but he looked like he might." When I relayed this to Holmes, his only reply was a quiet, "Ah, you don't seem surprised," I observed. "I'm not," Holmes said. "Every illusion has a shadow. We may have just glimpsed this one's." We returned to the Blue Swan and spoke again with Ellis and the maid, requesting a full accounting of all guests during the dates in question. The ledger was produced, and Holmes turned its pages with the calm of a man examining the death mask of a lie. "No guest matching that description," Ellis said firmly, "and certainly no one entered by the back." "Is there a record of anyone asking for Miss Kent or making an inquiry in person?" Holmes inquired. "None, sir." Holmes stood for a moment in silence, then stepped to the rear window overlooking the service yard. "There is no gate here," he said, "but a low wall abutting the woodstack, one with boot marks along the top." Ellis coloured faintly. "We don't monitor the back at night. There's no real need. Dartmore isn't exactly the East End." "The assumption," Holmes murmured, "that danger requires crowds is among the most costly errors of rural life." He turned to the maid, who had been quiet thus far. "You saw no man with a scar?" She hesitated. "Not directly, sir, but I did think I heard voices outside that evening. Not loud, but tense." "You didn't report it?" Well, I thought perhaps she was on the telephone, sir." "There is no telephone in room 6, Holmes replied. A silence fell. "Sometimes," Holmes said at last, "what is not remembered is more telling than what is." He closed the ledger with a soft snap, and what is denied too quickly may, in truth, be the most faithfully witnessed. As we stepped out onto the damp flagstones beyond the inn, I found my thoughts struggling to reconcile the mounting contradictions. "It seems plain to me," I said. "Miss Kent may have been lured here under false pretenses and abducted. The cufflink in the suitcase, the supper for two, the man with the scar. Someone came to meet her, and when he did, she vanished." Holmes gave a non-committal hum, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes studying the chimney smoke curling low over the moor. "You disagree?" "I do not refute your theory," he he said slowly. I merely regard it as incomplete. I waited. What if, he continued, Miss Kent was not abducted because she was never here? I blinked. But the room, the register, both easily falsified. The register signature is already proven forged. The room contained objects, yes, but no direct link to Eliza Kent. Not one. There was the hair, which, as we have established, does not match Miss Kent's known colouring. I stared at him. Then what are you suggesting? I am suggesting that the person we are told to believe was Miss Eliza Kent was, in fact, someone else entirely, someone who wished to appear to be her, briefly and selectively, the better to vanish without consequence. It was an idea I found deeply disquieting, not merely in its logic, but in its implications. Then we are chasing a shadow, I said. No, Holmes replied, eyes now bright with certainty. We are watching the shadow chase itself. We returned to London that evening, and it was the following afternoon when we paid a call upon the Kent residence in Kensington. Mr. James Kent received us with visible relief. My wife is in, he said, leading us through a corridor lined with stiff ancestral portraits. She has been most distressed by this affair. Mrs. Lydia Kent greeted us in a drawing room furnished in pale creams and unfriendly silks. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 35, with refined features and a composure that bordered on glassy stillness. She offered us tea with mechanical courtesy and sat beside her husband, her hands resting motionless upon her lap. Holmes declined refreshment and opened the conversation gently. We have reason to believe, he said, that the disappearance of your sister may not have occurred as presently understood. Lydia's brow furrowed slightly. I don't follow. We have traced her to a hotel in Dartmore, Holmes continued, where she stayed under her own name, yet the evidence of her presence is oddly curated. Then you believe she staged it? Lydia asked. Her tone was measured, but there was no shock in it, only interest. I believe someone did. There was a silence then, a long one. Holmes broke it with an odd question. Forgive me, was your sister right-handed or left? Right-handed, Lydia replied at once. Holmes inclined his head politely, then rose. As we left, he said softly. She answered too quickly. I looked at him in confusion. No one, Watson, he said, remembers a sister's handedness without thought, not unless they've recently needed to. As we made our farewells in the Kent drawing room, Holmes paused near the mantel, admiring a framed photograph of 3 women seated in a garden, 2 of them similar enough to suggest kinship. This must be your sister and Miss Eliza, he inquired. Lydia approached and nodded. Yes, that was taken at Camberwell 2 summers ago. Eliza's in the centre. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah yes, Miss Eliza Fielding. Forgive me, I meant Kent. There was not so much as a flicker from Lydia Kent. Of course, she replied. Eliza Kent. Holmes turned to me, then to Mr. Kent. A curious thing, is it not, Watson? Names are the most delicate of identifiers, so fragile when passed through memory. Later, once outside, I challenged him on it. You misnamed her deliberately? Naturally, Holmes replied. Miss Kent's full name was Eliza Margaret Kent, and Fielding was never associated with her in any known records. Then her failure to correct you reveals either stunning inattentiveness, he said dryly, or a rehearsed manner so carefully sculpted that it could no longer distinguish the living from the dead. I shuddered. You believe she killed her? Holmes did not reply, but his eyes, ever forward-facing, had already left Kensington behind and were fixed once more on a battered suitcase resting alone in the corner of his mind. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes returned immediately to the suitcase. Though it had sat untouched in our absence, he examined it with the care one might reserve for an unexploded device. I had never known him to regard an inanimate object with such unwavering suspicion. Watson, he said, You remarked that this suitcase bore signs of prior tampering. Let us now see whether it offers anything to reward that effort." He withdrew a thin blade, and with the delicacy of a surgeon, slit the seam of the inner lining. Beneath the muslin, there was indeed something more. Pressed flat and near invisible against the wood, a faint scrawl written in black wax pencil. Holmes held it to the lamplight and tilted it gently. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. "A cipher. Not a complex one, but it required concealment more than obscurity." He handed it to me. It was no more than a string of alphanumerics, but Holmes rapidly decoded it, muttering as he scribbled a translation on the back of an envelope. "Cottage, Elder Tree Road, Tavistock, under back eave, bring her soon." He set the envelope down with calm finality. "We are no longer chasing suggestion, Watson. We now have coordinates. The reference to bringing her is particularly interesting. You think Lydia Kent wrote this? I think whoever wrote it wished it to remain unseen by authorities, but not unread by one particular pair of eyes." He snapped the lining closed again and stood. "Prepare for Tavistock," he said. "I suspect the cottage will not welcome uninvited guests." Before we departed for Tavistock, Holmes once more turned his attention to the golden cufflink that had lain quietly within the suitcase, forgotten amidst more dramatic objects. "You see, Watson, most men of a certain class have cufflinks engraved with their initials, and yet this one," he held it up to the lamplight, "bears only a curious swirl, as if made deliberately illegible." I peered at it and found the lettering indeed ornate, beyond necessity. "Now," Holmes said, "observe what happens when I reflect it in the mirror." He angled the cufflink toward the small dressing glass on the mantel, and I gasped softly. The swirling shape resolved into 3 clear letters, JKE. "James Kent Eliza," I ventured. "James Kent," Holmes corrected. "His full name, as per our client's correspondence. The EC is decorative, a flourish, but the reversal, that is deliberate. To obscure it? Exactly. It was not placed here to identify, but to confuse." Holmes gently turned the cufflink between his fingers. "This is the mistake of a clever person, not a stupid one. The more one attempts to outwit perception, the greater the chance that intention leaks through." He set the cufflink down beside the deciphered address. "In the end, it is always the smallest things," he said, "that most reliably betray their authors." Before packing the suitcase for transport to Tavistock, Holmes reached for a small vial of reagent from his chemical shelf, a pale bluish liquid he had employed in past cases to detect organic residue invisible to the naked eye. "This particular compound," he explained, "will react to trace quantities of hemoglobin. Even blood dried and scrubbed clean leaves behind its tail." He dipped a swab in the fluid and ran it along the inner lining of the suitcase. For a moment, nothing. Then slowly, a ghostly crimson blossom unfurled near the bottom corner. "Good Lord," I breathed. "A smear," Holmes said calmly. "Wiped hastily, but not thoroughly. Its location suggests a trail, not pooling but transfer." He stepped back and surveyed the case anew. "Not just a vessel for travel, Watson, a vessel for concealment." He turned away, the room falling silent. Outside, the gas lamps flickered against the window pane. Inside, Holmes was already piecing together the unseen chapter. "Come," he said at last. "The suitcase has whispered its story. Let us now see what the cottage will confess." The following morning, Holmes made a most unexpected declaration. "You shall go to Tavistock without me, Watson." I stared at him. "Alone?" "Not quite alone. Mr. Kent will accompany you." Our client, who had arrived that morning in response to a brief telegram, looked equally surprised. "But surely your presence—" "My presence will only be of use once the right pieces are moved into place," Holmes replied. "For now, we require eyes unlooked for and movement undetected." "You expect danger?" "I expect observation," he said, "and it is often best to watch from behind the curtain." He handed me a note, folded thrice and sealed. Should you find anything at the cottage, do not act. Simply wire me from Tavistock Station with the phrase, "The eaves are inhabited." I shall take the next available train. Kent still looked puzzled. But what do you hope we shall discover? That, Holmes said, depends entirely upon whether the person who used that cottage believed it would remain forgotten. And so it was that I, accompanied by the increasingly anxious Mr. Kent, boarded the westbound train under a sky the colour of damp slate. Though I longed for Holmes's presence beside me, his sudden starts, his rapid deductions, his unrelenting calm, I understood the wisdom of his absence, for even before we arrived at our destination, I sensed that Holmes had already cast his net, and that all we were doing was sailing into it. The cottage in question lay on the edge of Eldertree Road, just beyond the stone wall that marked the Kent estate's original boundary. It was a modest structure, older than its neighbours and clearly less tended. Its thatch thinning, its shutters askew, and the lock on the front gate rusted into disuse. Mr. Kent had not set foot upon the grounds in many years, and his discomfort was evident as we approached. "My father had it built as a hunting retreat," he murmured. "After his death it passed to my mother, then to Lydia. I'd assumed it was empty." "And yet someone has left us an address," I said. "Not an accident, surely." Inside, the air held the scent of long disuse mingled with something faintly medicinal. The parlour was devoid of personal belongings save a single overturned chair and a layer of undisturbed dust. A threadbare rug had curled with age, and cobwebs swayed lazily in the corners. But it was the silence that struck me most, an unnatural hush, as though the walls themselves were listening. Kent stood in the doorway, glancing around like a man recognising a place that no longer remembered him. We moved through the kitchen and adjoining passageways with increasing caution. Everything bore the signs of vacancy, and yet there lingered in the corners a faint impression, as though the place had only just ceased pretending to be uninhabited. It was only when I entered the library, a small wood-panelled chamber lined with ancient books and stiff-backed chairs, that I felt the pressure of something deliberately concealed. I must confess, I had no intention of tampering with the furniture until my eye fell upon a narrow set of shelves in the far corner. Its wood warped more severely than the rest. It leaned slightly inward, as though resisting the uprightness demanded by the room. Approaching, I ran my fingers along the trim. There was nothing immediately suspicious. No obvious lever, no hinge disguised as moulding. And yet, when I placed my palm against the spine of a thick leather-bound volume near the base, the shelf groaned slightly. It did not creak as an old fixture might under its own age, but rather in response to movement. I pressed again, this time with both hands. The shelf did not swing outward, but slid sideways with a reluctant sigh, revealing a narrow aperture no more than 3 feet wide. "Good Lord," Kent whispered behind me. "That wasn't here before." "Or perhaps it always was," I replied, "but it preferred not to be found." The passage beyond was unlit. I drew a match from my pocket, struck it, and stepped cautiously forward. The walls narrowed to bare planks, and the air grew colder by degrees. I sensed at once that I'd crossed some invisible threshold, departed the realm of the abandoned and entered the realm of the deliberately hidden. A second door stood at the end of the passage, its surface plain, its handle brass and faintly tarnished. I turned to Kent, who looked pale but nodded. Together we opened it. The room into which we stepped could not have measured more than 10 feet square. It contained no windows, no wardrobe, and no evidence that it was ever intended for company. And yet it had been used, and recently. A thin mattress lay on the floor, its sheets rumpled and creased. Beside it, 2 stubbed candles had melted into a ceramic plate. Their wax pooled and cracked. A cracked mirror stood propped against the far wall, as though it had been carried there without intention to hang. And the air, cloying and unnatural, held the scent of perfume long settled into the grain of the wood. I moved carefully, examining each corner, a teacup still bearing a lipstick stain, a crumpled newspaper dated only 2 weeks past, a scarf, pale blue, with a delicate hem. Kent turned in place, his eyes wide. Someone lived here. Holmes's words echoed in my mind. Bring her soon. Not lived, I murmured. Waited. Kent knelt by the mattress, lifting the scarf between trembling fingers. My wife has one just like it, he said. Or did. We exchanged no further words. The silence spoke more profoundly than we could, for in that small, sealed chamber, unmapped and unspoken, we had found the living echo of a deception most carefully rehearsed. I reached into my coat and withdrew the envelope Holmes had given me. Without breaking my gaze from the cracked mirror, I turned to the small writing desk, removed a telegraph slip and wrote, "The eaves are inhabited. Send for Holmes at once." It was just past midday when the sound of wheels upon gravel drew our attention to the approach of a modest trap cart. From its seat stepped Sherlock Holmes, his long coat buttoned to the throat, his expression unreadable. Close behind followed Inspector Gregson, flanked by 2 constables in plain clothes. Holmes did not greet us. He moved directly past me into the cottage, his gaze flicking from floor to corner, with the precision of a man who knew precisely what he expected to find. He stopped at the mirror, adjusted its angle minutely, and nodded once. "You found the room as described?" he asked without turning. "Yes," I said, "and more than that, someone stayed here, recently." Holmes gave a soft, humourless laugh, and left no mark on the world but the scent of perfume and the crumple of a mattress. How very like her. At that moment, one of the constables emerged from the concealed passageway, nodding to Gregson. "Nothing else, sir, but the scarf matches the description, and the teacup bears her lipstick. We've confirmed it." Holmes turned to Kent, whose face had gone pale. "Mr. Kent," he said, "you must be prepared for a shock. The woman who vanished from Dartmore, the woman whose name was inscribed in the register and whose glove appeared in the suitcase, was not your sister-in-law." Kent blinked. "But the name, the handwriting, all forged," Holmes said crisply. "And the woman you never saw, the one the staff described vaguely and inconsistently, was your wife, Lydia Kent, in disguise." There was a long, terrible pause. "She staged her sister's reappearance," Holmes concluded, "in order to explain her disappearance." And with that, the curtain fell on the first act of Lydia Kent's quiet and terrible performance. Holmes gathered us around the hearth of the neglected parlour, his fingers steepled, his voice now cool and forensic. "Lydia Kent," he began, "has demonstrated a talent for 2 arts often overlooked in detection, the manipulation of presence and the shaping of absence." "She impersonated Eliza?" I asked. "Entirely," he replied. "Note the use of auburn hair, the forged signature in the register, the contrived meal for 2, all details inserted into the record not to establish Eliza's presence, but to suggest it through indirect evidence." "And why Dartmoor?" Kent asked. "Because it is far, isolated and theatrical. The perfect canvas for a vanishing act. She reserved a room under Eliza's name, wore her clothes and allowed herself to be seen just enough, but never too clearly." Holmes turned to the suitcase, now resting by his feet. "Then she returned to London and left behind this box of curated fragments, objects that belonged to no single woman, but to a story. A story meant to be found." "She wanted to shift the date of Eliza's death," I murmured. "Precisely. By fabricating evidence of her survival, she could deny all suspicion that her sister had vanished earlier and lay groundwork for some later discovery." Kent sat heavily in the chair, his hands trembling. "But why go to such lengths?" he asked. "Why lie? Why disguise herself?" Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. Because once a body has disappeared, the only way to exonerate yourself is to make it reappear. Holmes rose and crossed to the small desk beneath the cottage's shuttered window. From it, he withdrew a folded paper, one of Lydia's letters, recently recovered by Gregson from a private drawer in the Kent residence. "Note the phrasing here," Holmes said. "She took what I never could. That is not merely jealousy, it is prophecy." "Then she killed Eliza?" Kent asked hoarsely. "Months ago," Holmes said. "We believe in early January." He met Kent's eyes. "She poisoned her. Likely laudanum, introduced gradually. The dose escalated, and the death appeared natural, or rather, undetected. There was no immediate inquiry." "And the body?" "Originally hidden here," Holmes said, "in the suitcase." I gasped. "You mean to say, that same case?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "Cleaned and repacked later with its second act." He turned to Gregson. "There are signs the body was subsequently buried on the moor. We will begin searching near the bend in Wren's Hollow, where Lydia claimed Eliza once went walking alone." Holmes's voice grew colder. "Lydia's motive was layered. Jealousy, certainly, but also inheritance. With Eliza gone, and presumed alive but estranged, Lydia remained next of kin to their uncle's estate in Sussex, a sum worth over £10,000. Kent buried his face in his hands. "And the blackmail letter?" "A final ripple," Holmes said. "Someone, perhaps the maid, had doubts. That's what drew us in." He stood. "But this was never truly about blackmail. It was about performance. And Lydia Kent," he said grimly, "was an actress cast in a role only she knew would end in silence." "There remains," Holmes said, "the matter of the scarred man, the figure described by the stable boy." He stepped aside as Gregson signalled the constables. A door creaked, and a figure was brought in, a gaunt man of about 50, with a long facial scar and the expression of one used to speaking under caution. "Mr. Edward Halberd," Gregson said. "Former actor, spotted in Tavistock a month ago." Holmes addressed the man directly. "You were paid to stand near the Blue Swan Hotel at night. You entered from the back, were seen by the boy, and left at once. You made no contact with the staff." Halberd nodded slowly. "She gave me 5 guineas and a photograph. Said she needed me to be seen, not heard." Holmes turned to us. "Lydia employed him to serve as an illusion, a lurking male presence that would suggest danger to Miss Kent, and thus lend weight to her disappearance. It was the final stroke of misdirection." "Why the scar?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "She did not choose him for that. She simply allowed it to be noticed. The human mind cannot resist connecting mystery to deformity." He looked down at the suitcase, now empty of its false narrative. "The greatest deceptions," Holmes said, "are often built not on concealment, but on stagecraft." He paused. "And like the theatre, this case ends with the lights rising and the characters stepping forward in their true form." It was late the following evening when Holmes and I sat once more before the hearth at Baker Street, the fog tapping softly against the panes and the lamplight casting elongated shadows upon the bookshelves. My friend had resumed his usual posture, elbows on the arms of his chair, fingertips pressed together, gaze fixed into the orange heart of the coals. I, still reeling from the events in Tavistock, had not spoken for several minutes. The silence between us was companionable, broken only when Holmes, without shifting his gaze, said quietly, "You have questions, Watson." "Only one," I replied. "How?" He drew a breath, not of exertion, but of transition, as though settling himself to unroll a long and coiled narrative. "It began," he said, "with the suitcase, not in what it contained, but in what it lacked." I frowned. It seemed full of implication. "Just so, too full. A woman's glove, a man's cufflink, a hotel receipt, and a bottle of laudanum. Each item pointed outward, toward a narrative, but not inward, not to a person. That is what struck me. There was no anchor of identity, merely theatrical clues positioned like props on a stage. I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. She wished us to believe that Eliza Kent had travelled alone to Dartmoor, become distressed, and vanished. And she furnished just enough evidence for that idea to be believable, not provable. It was the restraint that revealed the design. I could not help but smile. You distrusted it because it fit too well. Holmes nodded. Nature is seldom tidy. Lydia Kent's mind, however, was precise. And when precision becomes theatrical, it reveals the hand behind the curtain. Holmes leaned forward and tapped his fingers against the grate, as if marking each point upon the bars. She played Eliza Kent, Watson, quite literally, disguised herself with a wig, modified her posture, affected her sister's handwriting, even ordered 2 meals to suggest companionship or peril. But she ensured that the staff at the Blue Swan could never describe her clearly. Pale, nervous, solitary, yes, but no details of her voice or face. Which would have been recognised as her own, I said. Precisely. The anonymity was intentional. Her goal was not to be seen, but to be half seen, so that the fragments could be assembled into the figure of Eliza Kent. He stood and paced slowly to the mantel, where the cufflink and the photograph from the Kent household rested side by side. She constructed her sister from memory and guilt, then placed that constructed self in the public eye, just long enough to fabricate a timeline, an illusion of Eliza's survival. But why? I asked. Why go to such lengths? Because the disappearance had already occurred. Eliza was already dead. The crime was in the past. What Lydia needed was a future, a plausible period in which Eliza could be said to have vanished under mysterious but independent terms. He paused. In doing so, she converted an unexplained death into a self-inflicted disappearance, and she needed only a handful of breadcrumbs to make us follow that trail instead of digging where she had buried the truth. I felt a chill that had little to do with the fire burning low between us. She rehearsed her sister's ghost, I said quietly. Holmes looked at me. Yes, Watson, and for a time, we nearly applauded the performance. Holmes resumed his chair and regarded the battered suitcase, now resting beside the hearth, as though it were no more than an old travel companion. That case, he said softly, was not simply a container. It was a confession. I looked at him askance. How do you mean? It mirrored the mind of its owner, not the absent Eliza, but the very present Lydia. She filled it not with memories, not with the past, but with symbols. Each one meant to nudge our interpretation in a chosen direction. The glove, the cufflink, the laudanum. All incomplete, all evocative. He lifted the cufflink between thumb and forefinger. Even this, engraved, reversed, almost artfully obscured, was a puzzle, a subtle dare. She could have used no cufflink at all. But she wanted to be chased, Watson. She needed the world to discover the clues, so long as they led away from her. She overplayed her hand, I murmured. No, she did what many clever criminals do. She calculated too much. The human mind, when anxious to avoid detection, often becomes performative. Lydia did not simply conceal, she composed. He tossed the cufflink back onto the mantel with a soft clink. And that, he said, was her error. I leaned back, breathing deeply. There's something almost tragic in it, I said, that she built a lie so carefully, only to be undone by her need to be admired for it. Holmes gave a rare, wistful smile. Conscience, Watson, will always leak through craft. A perfect forgery is impossible, for the soul stains everything it touches, even the inside of a suitcase. Holmes reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a second envelope, the original blackmail letter, now worn at the corners. The author of this, he said, was not our primary criminal, but the one who unknowingly gave her away. I frowned. Not Lydia? No, he said. The letter bears too many contradictions for her to have written it herself. Note the phrase, "The truth always travels lighter than a suitcase." It is poetic but clumsy, unlike Lydia's calculated precision, and the handwriting is not hers. He tapped the envelope gently. The key lay in a conversation you did not hear, between the parlour-maid, Miss Agnes Rowley, and the laundress on the back stair of the Kent residence. Miss Rowley had once served Lydia's family during her youth, and was later dismissed, abruptly, following Eliza's disappearance. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Agnes wrote this letter not from malice, but fear. She had overheard Lydia speaking to herself near the garden window, words that made no sense to anyone else, mentions of Dartmore before any such trip was known, and references to putting her away where the ivy remembers. She knew, I said softly. She suspected, Holmes corrected. And that suspicion, when coupled with a vague recollection of the cottage's secret room, became the germ of blackmail. He looked again at the fire. Agnes wrote as a warning, to dissuade Lydia from further invention, but in doing so, she triggered the very sequence that would expose everything. You see, Holmes continued, rising now and walking slowly to the window. Once the Dartmoor illusion had been staged, Lydia needed a place to retreat, somewhere she could vanish briefly, while appearing to have never left at all. He paused, hands behind his back. The hidden room at the cottage served that purpose perfectly. She stayed there herself? I asked. Yes, alone for 2 nights. She brought her sister's belongings, including the glove and scarf. She lit the candles, left the teacup, placed the mirror, and then she returned, silent, composed, and ready to receive our inquiries. I felt a chill despite the fire. She waited in that sealed chamber, I said, not because she had to, but because she needed the illusion to settle. Precisely, Holmes replied. It was not merely escape, it was timing. She allowed the memory of the Dartmoor appearance to ferment. Only then did she allow the blackmail letter to arrive, a letter she hoped would shift suspicion onto James Kent. But she did not anticipate your presence at Clapham Junction, I said. Holmes turned, a rare flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. No. And that, Watson, was her undoing. The suitcase was not meant to be found so soon. She had intended to discover it herself, perhaps weeks later, accidentally, thereby reinforcing the fiction of Eliza's movements. He returned to his chair, his expression now grave. In attempting to master perception, she became enslaved by it. Every act of concealment became a performance, until even she could no longer tell which mask was hers. For many days after, I found myself haunted not by the crime itself, wicked though it was, but by its nature. I have known Holmes to confront murderers driven by rage, by profit, by lust or revenge. But Lydia Kent belonged to none of these categories. Her crime was not born in violence, but in composition. She did not simply remove her sister, she replaced her. She choreographed her absence with such delicate precision that the absence itself became the lie. There was something uniquely chilling in this, that every clue we followed was placed not in error, but in invitation, that every deduction we made was foreseen and allowed. It is one thing to conceal a truth. It is another altogether to manufacture one. I had stood in that hidden room beneath the Kent cottage and felt not the presence of a criminal act, but of a stage awaiting applause. The mattress, the scarf, the scent of perfume. It was not a hiding place. It was a set. And I wondered then, not for the first time, how many truths we walk past each day that are, in fact, no more than carefully layered illusions. In the end, the tragedy was not Eliza's death, nor even Lydia's crime. It was that the world believed what it was told, and we nearly did too. Holmes stood at the window as I concluded my notes, his silhouette etched against the pale gaslight and the drifting veil of fog outside. He did not speak for some time. I let the silence linger. At last he said, "You recall, Watson, what I told you once, that truth is often like smoke. It does not vanish, but it clings to fabric." "Yes," I said, "I remember." He nodded toward the suitcase, now closed and resting once more in its corner. "That object," he said, "was not left behind by accident. It was abandoned, not because it had no value, but because it carried too much. Too many symbols, too many contradictions. The woman who placed it there hoped the world would read it, and yet hoped it would not be read too soon." He turned back to the fog. "People carry guilt as they carry luggage, awkwardly and with the illusion of choice. Lydia Kent thought she had unburdened herself, but the burden had only changed shape." I watched him closely, the firelight catching the side of his face. "Will she be convicted?" I asked. "She will," he replied. "The truth, once unpacked, is more stubborn than any disguise." He reached forward and touched the cold glass of the window. "And some suitcases, Watson," he said quietly, "are not forgotten. They are left behind, because the one who carried them could no longer bear the weight." As we stood by the fire in the quietude of Baker Street, I ventured a final question. "Do you believe, Holmes, that she ever meant to be caught?" Holmes did not look up from the smoke curling in his glass, but his tone was clear. "No criminal intends exposure, Watson, but the artist always leaves a signature, however faint. Lydia Kent constructed her lie with remarkable precision, but in the end, she failed to account for the simplest truth. Guilt always seeks an audience." He turned to me, his eyes cold and bright. "It is not concealment that dooms the clever. It is the desire to be understood." What do you think was Lydia Kent's greatest mistake? Was it in the details she forged or the ones she overlooked? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stood out to you most in this case. And if you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more investigations with Holmes and Watson, and share this story with fellow lovers of deduction and deception.